My name is Mike Seltzer. I'm the head strength conditioning coach at Bates College. I'm here for Figure It Out Baseball, and in today's video we're going to talk about and introduce the shoulder mobility series I'm going to put together for all of you. And in thinking about the video series, I thought it best to do this quick introduction video and go over a couple key concepts. So the first concept is to understand that the shoulder, like the hips, is a ball and socket joint. So if you think of a little socket, and then you think of the head of your humerus, so your upper arm connecting into the shoulder, there's just a ton of range of motion that those two bones should be able to express in space. So that means there's a lot of degrees of freedom. That also means that extreme range of motion, we need to be able to control that range of motion as you try and sling a baseball 100 miles an hour. That's obviously an extremely high velocity movement, and with all that range of motion, your shoulder's at a high risk of injury, which we all know from overhead athletes and baseball players specifically. So improving the mobility of the shoulder, not necessarily your flexibility, but your mobility, will allow you to control that massive velocity movement that you're trying to create. The second concept is an active versus passive range of motion. So your passive range of motion, for the example of shoulder flexion, would be what I would take an athlete's arm and I would actively move his or her arm through shoulder flexion, which is this motion, so that they're not really doing any work. So it's passive for them. And that would allow me to see some range of motion. It would let me see some compensations. It would let me have a conversation with that athlete. The second component is active range of motion. This is what the athlete does on his or her own. So I'd be standing off to the side, watching them doing on their own, and seeing the differences between the two, seeing where those compensations arise. You're always going to have a gap between active and passive range of motion. Okay, passive range of motion is always going to be a little bit more, and that's just kind of how our bodies work. But we want to try and bridge that gap as best we can. If we can bridge that gap, we're essentially creating a bigger surface area on our range of motion, on our control graph. Okay, so if we have a very small box that we can live inside as far as our range of motion with our shoulders and what we control of that range of motion, anything that takes us outside that box in a small kind of graph area will lead us to tissue breakdown, which is injury. So if we can expand the surface area, if we can expand the size of that box, we put ourselves in a much better position to be way more resilient and resistant to injury. Okay, so those are two of the concepts. The third concept, or the third thing to understand, is that mobility training for shoulder health, for range of motion, all that stuff it's hard work. It's not something that we put into a program for just a couple minutes as somebody gets off a foam roller. It's ongoing throughout the entire phase. It's ongoing throughout the entire cycle of phases in a long-term athletic training program. It's throughout the individual workouts. It's programmed with sets and reps to really induce a true training effect. It takes multiple inputs over a long period of time to produce the adaptation to the system that you're trying to produce. And in this case, it's improved shoulder health and mobility. And we need to define mobility as range of motion, but not passive range of motion. We want mobility to be a range of motion that you have strength and control over. And that's our working definition of mobility. So it's not just being able to move your arm into an extreme motion. I need to know that the athlete can move his or her arm into that range of motion and also produce some force and have some quality control over that movement. Another concept or another thing I want you to understand is that this does not replace any of your traditional shoulder care exercises that your trainer at home or your baseball coach might have you do. It doesn't replace TheraBand exercise or J-band exercises, any of that type of traditional shoulder care. It's in addition to and along with to just give you more tools in the toolbox to help you become as safe and strong as possible. Okay. The last thing I want to say is a lot of the words, terminology that I'm going to use in the sequential videos, I want to give full credit to Functional Range Systems, Dr. Andrea Spina, Functional Range Conditioning, all the instructors that have taught me through the multiple courses I've taken through them. this is kind of their methodology and their thought process. So I just want to make sure that they have full credit, and it's been extremely helpful in allowing me to teach my athletes all these concepts I just kind of expressed to you. And we've seen a lot less injuries with our athletes because of it. So I'm hopeful that as you watch the video series, if you do this the way that I'm going to describe to you, you'll be able to not necessarily create that range of motion that is necessary. It might be an improved range of motion, but we really want to have a range of motion that we have strength and control over, and that's called mobility. So again, Mike Seltzer, head strength conditioning coach at Bates College, here for Figure It Out Baseball. Thank you.